Hey, everybody. It's Daniel Bennett here with the CAI West Virginia Interest Group, and we are doing our informational interviews. And we have someone who I met at the convention of the WMCCAI in Washington, D.C., at the convention center. And he was there and just was incredibly informative about HOAs and issues. And he's been helping them for a very long time. And we are just so very honored to have Tom Willis here to talk to us about reserve studies, which will be the main subject, but also about some of the work that he does to help HOAs. And we also have here this morning Kathy Knight, who is our fearless leader and is may have some questions of her own, but we're here really just to hear from Tom, especially about the issue of reserve uh, studies. A lot of people, in my opinion, feel that they can just guess what a reserve study is. You know, back of the envelope calculations. We got so many roads, and here in West Virginia, HOAs own the roads primarily in the unincorporated parts of all the counties, so where they have HOAs or there are other private roads, and so they have that. Some have water systems, sewage, water supply, other types of infrastructure, and they don't have the requirement here in West Virginia to have a reserve fund. If they have a reserve fund, they don't necessarily have a reserve study that went into creating it in this type of level that I think that would be important. And then there's the question of should it be done every 3 years, every 5 years? What type of timetable should you have to revisit these questions? But it's a significant issue. And again, Tom, if you just introduce yourself and your company and talk a little bit about it. And if you talk about a different state versus our state, that's fine too. Just to give us some sense of what does it mean to do a reserve study? Why should you do a reserve study? Thank you.
Sure. No, thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to meet you, Kathy. And as I said at the DC conference, anything I can do to help community associations thrive, that's kind of like the mission of Association Bridge. And I'm really glad to see you guys getting things started in West Virginia. Um, my experience, the first 30 years plus or minus was on the management side. I served as an on-site manager, primarily like high rises, which are more intense when it comes to reserves because there's just more stuff. Then as a portfolio manager, and that's where I started managing like larger HOAs, where instead of vertical, we went horizontal, and it was a different animal. And then eventually wound up kind of on the executive side of the management company and whatnot. I opened up Association Bridge because in the early 2000s, I was doing volunteer training for CAI. Reston Association, which is one of the nation's first huge plan communities, used to host that every year. And most of the communities in Reston Association are teeny tiny little HOAs that they actually call clusters there. And I realized after teaching the class a couple times, there are so many community association volunteer leaders that didn't know information that I took for granted because, I was typically working for pretty large and sophisticated communities and whatnot. So started doing the consulting part-time back in 2006, did consulting work for the management company. So it was kind of natural in 2018. I, jumped off and I've been doing full-time consulting ever since assisting. And so through that time, it's been a great education because I see how reserve studies impact all kinds of different communities. It is interesting to contrast areas and laws. So your next door neighbors, in some ways, to Pennsylvania, which is next door neighbors to New Jersey. And there couldn't be a bigger contrast. New Jersey went from 0 to 100. They went from no requirement for reserve studies to probably what I consider the gold standard. A couple of years ago, CAI National upgraded in the wake of Surfside. They upgraded the reserve study requirements, which we all appreciated very much, tying in the importance of preventive maintenance for those associations that have larger structures. They started talking about structural inspections, things such as that. New Jersey took that and even upped it even a little more. And I have a couple of clients in New Jersey who are going through shock, but it's a great reality check. And a lot of us knew as soon as that law got passed, the first freak out was going to be, how much does it cost to get a reserve study? And then I knew once the reserve studies were done, the freak out was going to be, I had no idea we were so underfunded, right? Pennsylvania has nothing. And so the Keystone chapter, which covers both, when we rolled out, I was chair of the communications committee. When we rolled out the new law, we got a great engineer from Beck Engineering to write an article that explained in English for our Jersey members what that meant. And then for the PA folks, it was, you really, really, really ought to do that. So I would say that in West Virginia, we're in the, you really, really, really ought to do that. And here's why, right? So nothing lasts forever. And in my experience, what I've noticed, this is a broad generalization, but there are two kind of communities. The kind of communities that has somewhat higher fees that plans for the future versus the communities with low fees where they're going to get a special assessment or they're going to need a loan. And there's kind of not, it's just a matter of time. So the reserve study process is the process by which we identify those capital items, things that when we replace them or do major maintenance on them, perhaps, those expenses are not going to be included in our operating budget. So this is where we account for it. Interestingly, if this was a commercial property, they would expense depreciation, recognizing that things don't live forever, right? And so some of the pushback to funding reserves is, oh, I'm not going to be around when this thing comes up, as if it's not fair, right? But the truth of the matter is proper reserve funding, informed by a solid reserve study, is how to even out the expense for owners over the course of time. And one of the best, when I taught on this with a board member that was later a client, he had a really great way to put it. And this becomes, you sometimes get more pushback with the demographic of older residents. If you have a 55 and better community, they're like, I'm not going to be here in 10 years. It's not going to happen. I shouldn't have to pay. And his point was, you're not paying for the future replacement. You're paying for the current depreciation of that element that you're getting the benefit of, right? Yeah, when that roof eventually dies, somebody else is going to cut the check, but I get the benefit of that roof. I get the benefit of that road, right? So that's one way to look at it. And so how do we know how much to set aside? That's what the reserve analyst does. They're going to go out and measure, figure out how many linear feet or square feet of surface we have. They're going to figure out what kind of surface it is. They will include things depending on the community. It all depends on what the common elements are. Fencing, signage, stormwater management facilities. If a community has a clubhouse, that's going to be in there. If a community has amenities such as a pool, none of these things live forever. They will eventually have to have a major renovation or eventually replaced. So the reserve analyst's job is to analyze all that stuff, estimate in current dollars what it would cost to do that replacement now, and then escalate the cost because they're going to give a judgment on how many years this thing has left to live before we're going to do something about it. They then combine all that data and create a funding model. And they're going to be used what's called the cash flow method. So I'm so old. How old are you, Tom? I'm so old. I remember when reserve studies and some communities in the 80s and 90s used to fund using the component method. And that meant that every single component was its own animal, and you literally just added up how much each one of those was. The reason why cash flow funding came into play, which is kind of like just-in-time inventory.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is if I plot out on a chart what all my expenses are, I know what I have to spend. I then try to flatten out the curve with a funding plan that starts at a certain point and then make sure that we've got enough money in the coffers to pay for this replacement. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but things tend not to go as planned. Sometimes stuff dies quicker than we thought it was. Hopefully, things last longer than we thought it was. As a board members have a fiduciary responsibility, and this is one of the key concepts to really think about as we consider our reserve study plan and what's the wisest way to take care of people's stuff. If this was our stuff, if this was our house, we could do whatever we wanted. But in point of fact, your neighbors trusted you. They trusted you to do their business on their behalf, which means you're taking care of other people's stuff. And I always like to talk when I do board trainings. One of the things I kind of do is break down fiduciary responsibility because there's a legal way to do it, and it's all correct. But I just break it down and say, look, if your neighbor went on vacation for 2 weeks and said, please take care of the dog and feed the fish, you would probably take better care of those animals than you took care of your own animals. Why? Because your neighbor trusts you. This is a trust, right? And you would feel terrible if they came back and the fish is floating on the top and the dog's drinking out of the toilet. You would feel terrible because you're a good person. It's the same concept. If we're taking care of other people's stuff, that raises the bar. We don't leave things to chance. We are more conservative than we might be with our own stuff. And so therefore, when we get the results from our reserve analysts, knowing that things don't always go according to plan, it's not like we're going to plan it so that our reserves go to zero when this thing's going to die, right? We want to build in a cushion to make sure that we don't, that we're mitigating the possibility of disaster. So one of the challenges is to figure out what the minimum allowable balance is in that chart. And we're going to work with our reserve analyst to figure out what that is, because we want enough cushion so that if we have an unexpected failure, great example, there's two communities. I've never ever managed a community that had a dam. I don't have a clue how to maintain a dam, what you have to care about and all that kind of stuff. But I do know that if it fails, we're in a world of hurt, right? And so, I want to make sure that if that dam decides to shoot itself in the foot 5 years before we think it's going to do that, we've got enough money in the coffers to take care of that, right? So now we're realizing that this is a highly interactive process. We have to remember that the reserve analysts are generalists. They're not going to go in there and do a full engineering study on a dam, or if we've got a waterproofing membrane over a garage or something, they're not going to do destructive testing, things like this. They're going to look at generally what it would cost based on the size and typical construction expenses, what it will cost to do this job. They're also going to rely on us to give them accurate data in a couple ways. Number one, what's our beginning balance? What's our starting point? So typically, if we were doing a reserve study today, we are doing it for 2026. That's going to be the subject year, because ultimately the results are going to tell us how much to put in our 2026 budget, what the reserve funding should be, right? But that means that we have to estimate what our beginning balance is December 21, 2025. So we've got to calculate, whatever we've got now, plus what our current contributions are, less any projects. We know what we're going to do, right? We have to give them good data for the starting balance. Why? The higher the starting balance, the less you have to come with on the back end. The smaller the starting balance, the more we have to come up on the back end. So that's the first interaction. Second one is, what do we know? If we've got data on the components, we know when the clubhouse roof was replaced the last time and what it cost us, right? We'd want to feed that information to the reserve analyst. And if we've got something that's intense, matter of fact, Daniel, I think you grabbed a copy of the financial best practices booklet we came up with.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, which was 14 things your reserve analyst might not tell you, and it's not their fault. Remember that the reserve analysts, the standards are, they assume that you're going to replace like for like, component for component. And there may be times when if we upgrade a component or change things, we're going to spend more money. That's okay. But we're going to have to tell the reserve analysts, and we can't yell at them if we didn't do it.
Right.
Or if we're going to hire an engineer to run a complicated job, we've got to tell the reserve analyst that, hey, put in 15% for job oversight, something like that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So it's super important that we're collaborative with the reserve analysts. If we have one of those intense projects, it would make sense for us to pay for an engineering survey to figure out what that project's actually going to cost, or at
Hmm.
least our best guess. Feed that information to our reserve analysts. Why? Because perhaps you've seen this phenomena. There are some homeowners, and for that matter, board members, that don't understand that the budget process is a real thing, that the results of that budget is our actual operating plan for the next year. It's not an isolated theoretical thing we do just to keep the fees low. But sometimes people look at it that way. Reserve studies are the same thing. The biggest mistake that I've seen through the years is somebody goes, okay, I know they recommend that they do the reserve study, at least every 5 years, if not every three. We did the reserve study, we checked the box, we move on and ignore what the study says. That's nuts. This study is kind of like our long range capital budget, or at least it informs our long range capital budget. So number one, we make sure that we get good data up front. Number two, when we get the report back, we look at it carefully. We probably know the property in some ways better than the reserve analyst does. Maybe they miscounted something, maybe whatever, despite all the best, whatever, something doesn't look right. Before the board accepts that study, review it with the reserve analyst. Recognize that some things are discretional. I'll go back to the clubhouse example. It's kind of up to the board when you decide to renovate that thing, right? Is it 7 years? Is it 10 years? If it's not falling apart and it's mostly just a matter of a business judgment, you're going to have to tell the reserve analyst what your business judgment is. And if you need them to move something around, they're happy to do that before it's finalized. So now we think this all through. We've been collaborative. We've shared all the data. We've gotten the draft back. It's had some edits. It's now finalized. We now have our capital funding plan from year to year. And to your question is, how often should we do it? So we'll go do it. We'll go ahead and do a state by state comparative on this one. The Virginia Act says that the board is responsible for reviewing the study every single year. So the intent of that law is to don't forget what the plan is, figure out what it says, make sure you're thinking about it, and then plug that into your budget.
Hmm.
Maryland went a step farther. They said not only, oh, and both of them say you have to have it done every 5 years. So that's on the outside. That's fine. In Maryland, not only do you have to have the reserve study done, but you have to fund at least how much the study said. In Virginia, you can ignore it, which is kind of crazy. But so the intent was there. But that's why the legal the process of laws is interesting, because one person, one state learns from another, right? And Maryland goes, well, that's great. You should review it every year, but you probably ought to do what it says, right?
Can I
Well,
ask you a question
oh,
about
please.
that?
I've been
Okay.
going on for a while.
Um, you just said something interesting about the difference between Virginia and Maryland, the difference between looking at something and checking a box versus actually abiding by what you've come up with. And
Right.
um, that and I just want to just quickly ask you, not as a legal question, but as a
Sure.
general understanding of liability. When there's going to be a special assessment because someone in Virginia didn't do more than look at it and didn't abide by it, and there's a need for a special assessment, how should those members of that association feel about the liability when they're now stuck with a special assessment because the reserve study wasn't followed, in other words, and it was just a perfunctory look at it? Do you think that there's, for a board member, that there's any problem with not having done more like what happens in Maryland?
And you're right. I can't speak as a lawyer. I don't know that I've seen any D&O, directors and officers liability lawsuits come out of that. It certainly makes people angry. And sort of that's the democratic process. If you're ticked off or not, sometimes that's the thing that gets new people on the board. But I can't say from a liability standpoint, I can definitely, I don't think I can comment on that. I can
Okay.
comment that it's definitely not a best practice. Um, and the other thing to realize is I've worked with a couple of clients because sometimes that's what we do is try to help pull all this stuff together, right? Um, there have been clients that thought they had their stuff together,
Hmm.
but didn't have the safety net that they thought they did. And so when conditions changed or expenses increased significantly for a project, they did have to special assess, or more and more communities are turning to loans. It's very interesting to me that I used to walk into a national or a local CAI conference and there might be two banks. Now there's 20 banks. There's a reason for that. There's a high demand for communities willing to pay more in the long run with the interest, but lessening the hurt because there's a lot of deferred maintenance out there. And this includes places like the District of Columbia, like Virginia, like Maryland, where reserve studies are common practice. So sometimes it's just that's part of the reason I wrote the blog. The reserve study is the beginning of the process. That is sort of your baseline, right? That's your foundation. But it's got to be a living document. And in answer to your earlier question, how often should you get a no one done? I will sound like a lawyer. It depends. It's if you are at the highest and best of practice, it's a living document. And so that annual review, if you knew you spent certain dollars, or you found out that a project 3 years from now has a different value than what the reserve study does, having a mechanism to update the data every single year to help inform your decision on your reserve contribution is the best thing you can possibly do. And when the numbers are hot and heavy, one client I'm working with now that's fighting hard to get on the right side of deferred maintenance has 5 major projects in some form of planned, just done, or being done right now. And those numbers are super dynamic. And it really illustrates why you want to have what we might call a capital improvement plan
Hmm.
that kind of goes over and above our reserve study because it's more of a living document. They thought they were in good shape. But as it turned out, all 5 projects were way over budget, and they didn't think to add the engineering fees. And all of them had engineering fees because it was a high rise, and there was, I mean, like I could have written that whole blog just on that community. And so everything was over budget, and they thought they needed initially a $4.8 million loan. Then it was a $5.2 million loan. By the time I finished doing the cash flow projections and after plugging everything we knew into Excel, it was $8 million. So and that was just like the worst of all worlds because it was multiple high dollar capital projects and timing and all that kind of junk. But that's why we want to be careful with this stuff. If we update those numbers every year, probably getting a fresh study every 5 years is just fine. If we're not doing that, we may want to do it more often. Another strategic consideration is, let's say that you're a community that has some big ticket items. You're not 100% sure what they're going to cost, right? And you never do until you actually do the project. It's
Hmm.
always wise to build in some contingencies into a reserve plan for that. Sometimes the thing that triggers, I've got a client right now that is finishing up a whole bunch of big stuff. They finished their reserve study right around COVID. They got the results back in 2022. Um, Inflation's gone up a lot since COVID. So they've decided now that they've gotten over the hump of their big stuff, they know their big monsters are taken care of. They said, even though it isn't even quite 3 years yet, they wanted to go ahead and initiate a new reserve study because it just makes sense, right? We want to have clear numbers. And so they decided due to that, strategically, it would make sense to get a fresh set of eyeballs. Recognize as well, there are different levels to the reserve study. A level one reserve study is fresh eyes, inspecting everything, calculating from scratch. A level three is literally not showing up on site, grabbing whatever data you have and just doing a numerical calculation. Level two is kind of in between the two of those. So here again, there's some flexibility into what a reserve study is, and the board would need to make a business decision what makes the most sense for them. One other factor is that the reserve studies are getting pretty cool. A lot of them will either allow you to run what if scenarios. They'll give you the software so that you can input the numbers for yourself. Others are happy to do an annual update. You give the data back to them and they update it for you. And that can be a wise way to do it. If you don't want to do a capital improvement plan and do all the worksheets yourself, when the board is selecting a reserve advisor, you ask that question. Hey, what capabilities do you have for doing updates and what does it cost us? That didn't used to be the case. So that's been the reserve guys are doing some really great work these days.
Thanks.
The other factor to mention is what you said before. What is a reserve study? So the Virginia law doesn't define necessarily what a reserve study is. And you can go online right now and get a DIY reserve study. I've seen a few of them. You literally plug the numbers in, they do the calculations, and then that's allegedly a reserve study. I don't know about that. It makes an awful lot of sense. CAI has a professional designation called RS, Reserve Study, and that's a professional who has to provide you a study that's in accordance with the highest standards that CAI has put together. Those standards are pretty darn good. So I think you do want to look for somebody who's got the RS designation because they've got a lot of experience. There's an experience factor in getting that designation. They've worked with different community associations. I have had reserve studies done by architects and others through the years, and they were sometimes okay, but community associations are a unique niche. Working with business partners who understand what is a board, what is the board's duty, all that is so huge. And that's one of the things that I'm glad that you guys are, trying to get things together for a local chapter, because in time you will draw business partners who know how to deal with community associations, and will take very good care of them. And sometimes boards don't want to hear it, but there's a whole lot of contractors out there that want nothing to do with homeowners associations. They don't want to deal with a board. They don't want to go to night board meetings. They don't want to have owners, confronting them on the grounds and yelling at them, which shouldn't happen anyway, but sometimes it does. So, reserve studies are a professional discipline in a specialized niche, and working with partners who understand both of those can be really, really, really helpful.
Well, thank you. This has been great. I just want to first, before I ask you a couple more questions, go over two quick things just for our audience in case they're not familiar with a couple things. One is Surfside. Just everybody in the community association space, especially the condo world, there is now what is called shorthand for catastrophe. And I actually met someone recently at our advocacy day who knew someone who held on and jumped across and saved themselves and was not one of the nearly 100 people who died there. But it was in Miami Beach, a condominium. You can look it up, and due to factors, half of it or so collapsed, killing nearly 100 people. And it is now on the lips of everybody in the community associations world as shorthand. So everybody who heard you say that understand that was the reference. You can look it up, and you may remember it from your memory when it was worldwide news. But that's Surfside. On the other hand, I've also heard it used a little bit too much to scare people. You need to
Yeah.
do the right thing, but it is important to know that that is a shorthand for you better do your work. The other thing I'll just mention is that ESOPs, the ant and the grasshopper. And so when you were talking about, the two boards, the one that uh, has the lowest uh, yearly fee versus the one that has factored everything in so that they don't get surprises. It reminded me of Aesop's The Ant and the Grasshopper, the ant that studiously makes sure everything is done, and the grasshopper who enjoys fiddling away and doesn't plan for the winter. So I think that is a very important thing. And my question goes to that when it comes to here in West Virginia, where we have a whole bunch of smaller HOAs, not the condos, not the big ones that probably could afford to have property management easily,
Hmm.
but the smaller ones that are only 25 to 100 plots. Do you have any suggestions or ideas about reserve studies where, it can be several $1,000s to do a reserve study? And so when that is a significant amount of money split among as few as 15 and or so, and even up to 100, that seems pretty big. Do you have any words of advice for the smaller HOAs?
Sure. And this really came from my experience, that early experience I told you about working with those small associations in Reston. And the discussion there wasn't about reserve studies, it was about audits. And it was like, well, the audit would be half my budget. So what we kind of came up with was sort of like an operating reserve. If you have something that is going to be a real bear and it would cause a big blip or even require a special assessment, sometimes what you can do is chunk it up. Eat the elephant one bite at a time. Go ahead and budget for an operating reserve, or you could even call it a reserve study reserve or something like that. Set aside a certain amount. You get an estimate from somebody. You find out how much it's going to cost. You go, okay, our goal is to get this done in 3 years. Divide it by three, set it aside, and there you go. And if that becomes a regular feature in the budget, and you are tracking it on the balance sheet as equity, in other words, a set aside, dedicated funds for a purpose, that might help to ease the burden somewhat. So that can help. In the short term, my guess is, and for a smaller association, there may be very few common elements anyway. And there are a few in the marketplace. There are a few reserve analysts that I think are pretty good, at least in the DMV area, who are not as expensive as some others. I don't know that I would recommend them for a very complicated community, but they're
Hmm.
really good for a smaller community. So I think as time goes on and the chapter, finds resources to take care of its members, I think you'll probably wind up finding some good resources that'll take care of you there. But probably what your one biggest scary area is. It might be roadways, right? And it may be as much as we appreciate the independent engineers because they don't have a dog in the fight. If we've got a local contractor that does a lot of that work, the next time that you're doing a sectional repair or you're, milling and paving chunks of the road that aren't doing so well or potholes or something like that, you don't want to abuse your contractors, but you say, hey, what do you think we should be setting aside for a major project? What are you seeing, right? See if you can gather practical data that might help you to start to get there. And if you get a scale number, start increasing your reserves in advance of the reserve study so that you're not completely freaking out. So it may be that if you can identify your largest, it's really what this is risk management, right? If you identify your biggest risk, there may be some practical ways for you to at least get a back of the envelope number that makes sense, that moves you toward a number that you will lock in labor. So those would be the two things I would do is to consider funding over time so that it's not such a big hit, and that smooths out our fees for this thing. And secondly, identify your biggest risks and see if you can get some practical advice on what you should start to be setting aside for that, so that you won't get such a big hit later on.
Thank you. Well, this has been incredible. I do want, before we completely wrap up, ask you to talk a little bit about, and you did it at the beginning, talking about how you got to Association Bridge, but just if you could talk briefly about the services you provide specifically, and I'll have a link to your blog as well as your company's website. But if you could just talk about that a little bit, that'd be wonderful.
Sure. No, I appreciate that opportunity. So the reason we called it Association Bridge was while I was managing, I saw gaps. There were things that when we did them, it made a big difference. And these weren't things that were typically in a management contract. It kind of started with board training. I always tried to help my boards to take the CAI training, but sometimes they didn't want to dedicate that much time. So I developed a customized program. The nice thing about teaching that publicly is board members get to talk to other board members. The
Hmm.
downside is when I teach that, I have to teach generically. And it's kind of cool to be able to teach your specific bylaws, your specific situation. So I started doing that. And in other cases, we really don't talk about strategic planning still very much in our industry. And I noticed that the most successful, I started doing annual planning. If I couldn't get my boards to do big time strategic planning, it was a real simple process. Right after the annual meeting, and sometimes the best time to do this was after they had a horrible annual meeting, and we go, boy, we don't want to go through that again. No, that was terrible. Hey, I got a crazy idea. Let's talk about what we want to be able to say at the next annual meeting, and then I can reverse engineer that stuff, and we can actually get junk done. And boards, hey, what a cool idea. So that became something that we started doing, just basic strategic planning. And it's grown. So we're doing the stuff that typically isn't in a management contract. Sometimes I'm getting the calls from the engineers on this project that say, "Hey, we're getting questions. It's outside of my range. I don't know how to run a town hall meeting to explain all this stuff to the owners. I don't know how to get a loan. I don't know how to do the financial analysis to figure out what all our different options are." So we do that. Um, Developer services. One thing that the community associations as a whole hasn't done well through the years. It's pretty much assumed that every time a community turns over from developer control, that there's going to be a lawsuit and management gets fired. But that's crazy. It doesn't have to be that way. So we developed a program that I still do now of education, working with the developers first to make sure they buy in, and then helping the owners to be prepared for transition. And when you do that, it's nice and smooth, because nobody wins in litigation. Nobody wins. So if you can actually get stuff done anyway. So the end of the day is obviously, as you can tell, I really stink at having an elevator speech. Um, Pretty much, we're the guys you call when you don't know who else to call. And we find a way to get it done. And I get to leverage those 30 years of my old boss throwing me into every messed up situation known to mankind and telling me I just got to go fix it. So, one community, self-managed community, I live in the Philadelphia area, and I'm doing more of these pretty much board interventions where things are just blowing up. And sometimes you need a disinterested third party to help identify things, get them calmed down. I'm not a trained mediator, but I know how to get stuff done. So I guess that's it. If you got a gap, we'll try to bridge it. If I'm not the guy for it, I'll find you somebody who will. And don't worry, I won't charge you for that. But we just want community associations to be successful. We want leaders and managers who support volunteer leaders to enjoy what they do. And I've seen success, right? I want members to love where they live. That can happen. And so whatever we can do to help that to happen, that's what we do.
Well, Tom, this has been fantastic. Go ahead and give me and our audience your contact information. We'll have it below, and we'll put it on our website, but and the outgoing uh, information. But go ahead and just tell us.
Sure. The email is tom@associationbridge.com. The website is www.associationbridge.com. That one hard to figure out. The blog is tomosaurusrex.com because I am the dinosaur. So any of those will work.